Okay, my first question for you, Pastor Steve, says this. From Mary, she says, I was wondering how 2 John 10 through 11 applies to today's culture. For instance, when the Mormon ladies come knocking at my door and I welcome them into my home in order to minister to them. Is this wrong? And then she says, also, if I have family in need of shelter, but they don't believe Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, but I welcome them into my home, would that again be wrong?
Right. Mary, the context in 2 John it has to do with a couple of things. One of them has to do with the fact that we're not just talking about unbelievers here, we're talking about deceivers. If you look up in verse 7, it says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. And so what John's talking about is false teachers. He's not talking about people who are unbelievers. And so that takes care of your family members. The Bible teaches that we are supposed to be taking care of our family. And in fact, in Timothy, it says that if you don't take care of those in your own household, you're worse than an unbeliever and you've denied the faith. And so obviously we need to be taking care of people in our homes, in our families. The other thing that you have with this is you need to understand what was going on at the time. When it's talking about, for example, in verse 1, it says, to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in the truth. Then he goes on and talks about, verse 4, I've rejoiced greatly that I found some of your children walking in truth as we receive commandment from the Father. There's a couple of different ideas about who John is addressing. One idea is that when he says to the elect lady, he's actually talking about the church. And that's a pretty common interpretation of this passage. I don't necessarily hold to that, but the church is pictured as a woman in the Bible as the bride of Christ. And so if that's the case, then it's literally a letter to a church warning them not to allow false teachers into their fellowship. And so that would be the case there. I kind of think it's probably just talking about a woman that John knows, and when it talks about allowing them into the home, if you look down in verse 10, well, you talked about verses 10 and 11. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, and this again is letting you know that this is a doctrinal issue, do not receive him into your house nor greet him, for he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. Most likely what's going on here is John's talking to a lady who has a church in her home. In the first century, they didn't have church buildings, and so every church was basically a house church or a home fellowship. And so that's why in towns you can have multiple elders and have one overseer over them. For example, like in Ephesus, Timothy was the overseer, but you had multiple elders because they were home fellowships. And one of the things that also happened in the first century was that you would have preachers going around from town to town and sharing the message of the gospel. So they would come to churches to share. And it was a common thing in the first century. In fact, still in Judaism to this day, in synagogues. And that's where the church came from. It came out of the synagogue. In Judaism to this day, if there's somebody notable in the congregation, many times they'll ask them if they want to stand up and address the congregation. And so that was something that was common in the first century, and many times false apostles and false teachers would come into a fellowship. And what Paul says in Acts chapter 20, what Jesus commends the church for in Revelation chapter 2, at the church of Ephesus, and most likely what John is talking about here is the fact that they would check people out before they allowed them to teach, and if they were false teachers, then they wouldn't receive them into the home or into their home study, that kind of situation. And so I do the same thing that you do. When Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses come over, I bring them into my house, and I'm as kind as I can be to them, and I share the gospel with them. I let them say what they want to say to me, and I listen politely, and then I begin sharing the truth of the gospel to them. And so that's a different thing than if I allowed one of them to come into my fellowship and stand up front and address the body of believers. It would also be a different thing if I had a home study, I've had home studies over and over in my home. I would never allow somebody like that to come into my home study and address the people in my home fellowship as far as teaching goes. They're allowed to come in. They're not allowed to address anybody.
Right.
And so they're not allowed to spread false doctrines.
So one thing with that is it's always about, obviously we love people, but the issue is who is getting affected, right? So relationship-wise, yeah, we love people. We share the gospel with them. It's our lives. It's our love for one another. The Bible says that lets them know that we're believers, that draws them in. Right. But anytime you're talking about the things you mentioned, church, Bible study, any really authority structure, you got to be concerned also about the other people that are there.
Yeah.
And so that's why Jesus...
Yeah, that's why the word pastor comes from the word for shepherd. And so that's why pastors are called shepherds. They're supposed to watch over the flock, the people that are there, and make sure that they're not getting trashed by wolves or or getting bad food or whatever. So
okay,
yeah.